Okay, so just a little bit of background on why we're having this conversation today. In 1972, the US Supreme Court issued its ruling in Furman versus Georgia. Although the court did not hold that the death penalty itself was unconstitutional, it did rule that the way that states were imposing it was so arbitrary and inconsistent that it violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Overnight, death penalty statutes across the entire country, including here in Florida, were effectively invalidated, and hundreds of death sentences were reduced to life in prison. States responded by rewriting their laws in an effort to address the court's concerns. Florida led the nation in this effort, no surprise, and following a special legislative session in December 1972, became the very first state to rewrite and reinstate its death penalty statute. 4 years later, in 1976, the Supreme Court decided Gregg versus Georgia and several companion cases, including Proffitt versus Florida and Jurek versus Texas. Forgive me if I've mispronounced that. At the time, the court believed it had found a constitutional way to administer the death penalty that would be fair, consistent, and reserved for the worst of the worst. Executions were allowed to resume across the entire country, and Florida was just the second state to do so when it executed John Spankelnick in 1979. And I know a few people just got here, so welcome in. You are joined by incredible panelists for this conversation about Florida's death penalty after 50 years. And with that, I am going to introduce our lovely panelists and then pass it back over to Grace before we start. First up, we have Michael Radelet, who is, anybody who knows Florida's death penalty is probably familiar with his name. He is a professor emeritus of sociology, emeritus, at the University of Colorado Boulder, and took this role in 2001 after 22 years at the University of Florida, where he was active in Florida death penalty scholarship with the Capital Defense community. He has written or edited 8 books and some 100 scholarly papers focusing on problems like erroneous convictions, racial bias in sentencing, and ethical issues faced by healthcare personnel who are involved in capital cases and executions. So thank you for joining us. Next up, we have the wonderful David Kendall, who has a very diverse and lengthy legal career in criminal representation, commercial arbitration, and First Amendment realms. After studying at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, graduating from Yale Law School, and clerking for Justice Byron R. White, he spent 5 years as Associate Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, litigating a variety of civil rights cases and defending a large number of death penalty cases. He represented clients at trial before state Supreme Courts, in the Supreme Court of the United States, and in state and federal post-conviction proceedings. He argued Coker versus Georgia, in which the Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional for rape. He represented Florida death row inmate John Spankelnick in extensive appellate and post-conviction proceedings, and represented Utah inmate Gary Gilmore's mother in seeking a stay of execution from the Supreme Court. Today, he continues to practice at Williams & Connolly LLP, and we are very grateful that he is here with us. And finally, certainly last but not at all least, is the wonderful Susan Carey. Susan Carey's very first meeting with the death row inmate was December 1974, when she was just a first-year law student at Florida State University. The inmate she met with was just 15 years old. She has been working with inmates and their families since that time, pre-trial when difficult decisions have to be made, during and throughout incarceration, at the end of life, whether by natural causes or by execution. Susan has been a member of legal teams representing many of the first individuals facing execution after Gregg and Proffitt, and remains incredibly active in the national and Florida capital defense community. And of course, joining them in conversation, and who I will pass it off to, in remembrance of some other scholars who have come before, is Grace Hanna, our wonderful executive director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And she will be moderating this incredible panel for us. And I will be here as assistant tech support as needed. But thank you all, and take it away, Grace.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you to all of the panelists for joining us. And before we get started, before we all invited you all into the room tonight, we were having just a wonderful conversation about these panelists and also their mentors and the people who came before them. And they asked if they could have just a moment to share some names of people who influenced their careers and who were there doing this work alongside them. So before we get started, I'd love to pass it off to the three of them to share a bit.
Okay, I'll start. These are our ancestors, the people that came before us or with us on this journey. Some of them are still living, many of them are not, but they should be as much part of this story of the history of the Florida death penalty since 1976 and before that. So in no particular order, I want to say their names so that they can be present with us as well. Tony Amsterdam, Jack Greenberg, Toby Simon, Charlotte Holdman, Craig Barnard, Dick Joranby, James Ferguson, Ron Tabak, Bill Shepard, Roy Black, Bob Harper, Steve Goldstein, Bob Dillinger, Deborah Finns, Jack Boger, Joel Berger, Karen Gottlieb, Edith Georgi, Margaret Vandiver, and I think others. Mike had some people to add as well, and David.
Well, I just want to repeat Tony Amsterdam's name, which Susan led with. He's kind of the dean of the anti-death penalty effort. He was an original organizer, argued a number of cases. One of the two best lawyers I've ever been in contact with. I would add to the list Susan had some of the other LDF lawyers, including Peggy Davis, who is now professor of law at NYU, Jack Himmelstein, Michael Melsner. I think there are others. Charlotte Holdman also should be recognized for her work.
And the one name that I wanted to add was Henry Schwarzschild, who for several years was the head of the Capital Punishment Project at ACLU in New York.
And you wanted to add Hugo Bedeau as well.
Oh, yes. Hugo Adam Bedeau, the top death penalty scholar of the 20th century, who wrote a number of books, including The Death Penalty in America. I'm looking at the book right now, Don't Leave Home Without It. There are others. Bill Bowers at Northeastern wrote a great book, Legal Homicide, in 1984. And also former death row inmates who wrote their biographies, families of death row inmates who shared their histories. Lots of people involved in this.
I had one more person we should add, and that's Sister Helen Prejean. When we first heard that a nun was writing a book about the death penalty, people kind of like, oh, well. And it's turned out we were 100% wrong. And she has done probably more to normalize conversation and to get people talking about what is right and what is wrong in the world. So she should be part as well.
I remember when I first heard her name, I was leaving Florida State Prison after last visits with Freddie Good in April of 1984. And I got in my car, turned on the radio and said, tomorrow there will be two executions. One is Freddie Good, Arthur Frederick Good in Florida. And the second one, Patrick Saunier, who was the subject of one of the cases in Dead Man Walking. And his last visit was with Sister Helen Prejean. And I thought to myself, oh my God, they're not only going to kill the guy, he's got to deal with a nun. But we've all moved on from there.
Wonderful.
Quite ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
What a great way to start, just reflecting on all of the people who are involved in this work, from scholars and lawyers and people on death row and their families and victims and their families, and just really at every stage. I think every death penalty case touches so many lives along the way. And while you three are just a small sample of those lives who have been touched by it, you are certainly a big part of the story here in Florida. And so with that, I'd love to ask really all of you, if you could go back to the summer of 1976 and share a bit about where you were professionally when Gregg and Proffitt were decided. And do you remember learning that the US Supreme Court had cleared the way for the return of the death penalty, and anything about what your initial reaction to that might have been?
For me, it was one of the pivotal days in my life. It's sort of, where were you when John Kennedy was killed? Where were you when the Challenger exploded? And I was walking out of FSU. It was the literal eve, July 2nd, 1976, the eve of the bicentennial, and all the news was about the tall ships that were coming and all. And here, the United States Supreme Court had said it was okay to kill people. I was stunned. I couldn't believe that they would do that. And I did not have any idea what to do, if anything. And I thought about George Vasile, the 14-year-old had been 15 at the time, actually. I thought about him and our decision as a society to say the only thing we could do to this child was to kill him, and that this was somehow going to be okay by the United States Supreme Court. Until then, I had held in great reverence and realized they were really wrong about this. So it's quite a shock to me personally, and I had some real soul searching to do. I eventually took on Walden Pond and saw Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and went to the beach for a week to sort of see what to do. And I realized the truth of, first of all, well, yeah, gee, maybe it's their karma. I don't know. It just seemed wrong to me, but who am I? And then I thought, wait a minute. If I had seen a ship sinking before me at the beach, what would I do? Walk away? It's your karma, sorry. I realized I would try to save as many people as I could. And I realized I should probably do something. And actually, many, 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 many years later, one of my best people on death row, who was executed in 1992, said to me, Susan, this is a war, and you will win eventually, but you cannot expect to have no casualties.
Wow. Wow. Mr. Kendall, do you have any reflections about what you were doing at the time and kind of that day?
I can tell you precisely where I was. I was in the clerk's office of the U.S. Supreme Court. I'd come down from New York that morning. We had heard, really for the 10 days preceding that the death penalty cases were coming down soon. And I finally got enough information that I thought, it's going to be tomorrow. As I recall, it was a Friday. So I came down Friday morning. I had been told the day before by one reporter that we were going to lose 7-2. I was told when I got to the Supreme Court, I met somebody from LD out there. The two of us went to the Supreme Court. This was before faxing. And so in order was the courier. And so when the decision came down, it was a little after 11 o'clock. It was announced, and I then assembled the various opinions, got on the shuttle, and went back to New York. It was a terrible blow, even though we had won the two mandatory cases. Back in January of that year, once the Supreme Court had gotten, Justice Douglas died and retired 75. The president appointed John Paul Stevens almost immediately. He was a judge on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, nominated by Nixon. In an amazing thing for today, and given what Supreme Court confirmations have been like. Justice Stevens was approved within a week by a vote of 98-0 in the Senate. Well, that triggered our case. We had a number of cases up there. And so we researched Justice now Stevens intently. Then in January, that's January of 96, the Supreme Court granted review in 5 cases, Gregg versus Georgia, Proffitt versus Florida, Woodson versus North Carolina, Jurek versus Texas, and Roberts versus Louisiana. 2 of those, Roberts and Woodson, were mandatory death cases. Florida and Georgia had bifurcated trials where guilt was determined at the first stage. And then at the second stage, pursuant to supposed guidelines, the penalty was assessed, which could be the death penalty. Jurek was kind of a mixture of those 2. In any event, the decision came down. I was just personally devastated. We had to get the thing back to New York to get it copied, get it distributed, get it understood. Very long. We had a press conference that day. Jack Greenberg and Tony Amsterdam did most of the questions. The press, it was your typical press conference on a controversial issue. And then in the days afterwards, which was the bicentennial, this decision came down on July 2nd. The bicentennial 4th was 2 days later. The period thereafter is kind of a blur because we had to immediately now let our clients know, which usually meant mailing them and also calling them when we could. And we also had to develop a plan for the future because all of a sudden, although death row was cleared out for the people facing mandatory death, everybody else was kind of green lighted, whatever it was. So we were going to have to worry about real executions in those cases.
Yeah. Wow. And you mentioned the mandatory cases. I'll note that at the beginning of 2025, Florida passed a mandatory death law for undocumented immigrants, and it has yet to be challenged because they haven't charged anyone under it. But it is always interesting how history repeats itself over and over. And Dr. Radelet, you were not in Florida in the summer of 1976, so you did come a bit after that. Could you speak a bit about, one, what you were doing at the time, and if you recall at all what the reaction in other parts of the country were as executions began as well?
Sure. I was doing a postdoc in psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin Medical School and had never taken a criminology course in graduate school. I didn't know anything about it. But I remember when John Spinklink was executed quite clearly. I had just accepted the job in Gainesville, and I thought, oh my God, I just took a job in a state that's killing people. And I decided that as soon as I got to Florida, I was going to try to do something about it. So I got to Gainesville. This is in the fall of '79, and there was a group meeting, called Students Against the Death Penalty. So I went, and there was a woman there who was collecting data on who's sentenced to death in Florida. Her name was Kay Isley. She worked with Bill Shepard in Jacksonville. And she said, oh my God, I've got all these data and I don't know what to do with it. And I had taught statistics before, and I did know, black, white, yes or no. And so that was my first publication on the death penalty. A couple of months later, in November of 1979, I was walking around campus and there was a picket line. What the heck? Get on the picket line. It was because Governor Bob Graham was speaking at the Florida Blue Key banquet on campus. So I, joined the picket line. What the heck? And met a young scholar named Margaret Vandiver. And Margaret was friends with John Spinklink, friends with other death row inmates. And she said, hey, come on out to Stark, meet some other inmates. So through Margaret, I started to visit a death row inmate, Steve Beatty. He later took his own life. And then I visited another guy, Steve Bright client, J.D. Rawlerson, who was executed in 1985. And from those inmates and from their families, and then Rawlerson was executed in 85. And by that time, I knew enough lawyers. Gainesville was 35 miles to the prison. The lawyers were 150 miles away in Tallahassee. So the lawyers asked me to, take this paper and get it signed, or just go out and be with the guy. So anyhow, sort of the back door into what turned out. I was teaching in the medical school in Gainesville for half-time for 10 years. And then I decided, say what you will about death row inmates, are a lot more interesting than medical students.
That's the truth.
Yeah,
True.
yeah.
True. For this kind of period of time, 76, from Gregg and Proffitt to 79, when executions resumed, I think the realities of representation for people sentenced to death are very different than they are today. And if any of you have anything to share about how people on death row obtained counsel who represented these individuals, and what that looked like.
I can talk a little bit about that. I was at that point in Tallahassee, and there was a group called the Southern Coalition on Jails and Prisons. It was based in
Nashville,
one of the Tennessee cities, Nashville, headed by, Joe Engel. In Florida, we had the Florida Coalition on Jails and Prisons. Florida Clearinghouse on Jails and Prisons, called the Clearinghouse. There was also a group in Alabama, in Georgia, in Virginia. I think that was it. Maybe North Carolina. Anyway, the Southern Coalition on Jails and Prisons.
and Louisiana.
Okay, I knew there was one other state in there. And we had just been talking about the jail conditions, but it became clear, well, what happened first after the 1976 ruling was Reuben Askew was the governor at the time, and he started holding clemency hearings for the people that were sort of the furthest along. I don't even know how they decided, but had been there the longest. I'm not even sure not sure that there was ever any. Mike might have researched that more, but at any rate, after the clemency hearings were held, and clemency was a real thing back then. There was money for lawyers to be appointed to do clemency hearings. There was money for investigation. There were fees available. So lawyers were willing to do those clemency hearings. Unfortunately, a couple of times it became not great. I remember one hearing where the clemency board is the governor and two cabinet members. And the attorney general is one of those people. The attorney general at the time asked this public defender, okay, you argued Clifford Hallman this morning, and now you're arguing Gary Alvord. Which one do you want? They said that to him. And the public defender said, well, Clifford Hallman is not the lost cause that Gary Alvord is. So guess what? Clifford Hallman got clemency and Gary Alvord got a death warrant eventually. So it was not a good system, but at least there was some money. But there was zero money for doing anything after the first appeal. Public defenders by statute and under the Gideon decision lawyers are mandated for trial and the first appeal, and that's all. But there are other legal proceedings that can happen. It's just that there was no right to counsel there. There were no lawyers. So we at the clearinghouse, first of all, sent letters to everybody that was then on death row saying, do you have a lawyer? Or who is your lawyer? Or what is your situation? This was our first encounter with doing anything about this, was just, okay, I was still in law school. So I was not a lawyer, but I certainly could write a letter to say what is going on with your case. I remember one response was, "My condition is like unto madness. I have no idea what is going on." And so very quickly we had to pivot. And then we got in, the Legal Defense Fund found us and gave us some guidance of what we needed to do. But for a long time, for many years, at the beginning of this, there were no lawyers. John Spinkelink had a death warrant signed in 1977 in September. That was the first death warrant. The death warrants were 1 week long at that time. And to get everything done in 1 week was impossible. And this is when the big people from the Legal Defense Fund, and David can step in here and say, what was going on up there. But that's how that part happened. It continued for several years. We realized after the warrant with John Spinkelink that somebody needed to be near the prison because there was just too much to do at the prison that a lawyer needed to do, making sure that they were treated right and going to visit and taking, as David said, this is before fax machines or anything like that. And we had to take communications. We would meet in Live Oak, sometime at the rest stop at Live Oak. And get documents and come back and swap them and go to, you guys can't even believe, we would send things by air to the airport in Atlanta, and Steve Bright of the Southern Coalition of Sheltered Prisons would pick the stuff up and get it to the court. I mean, it's like the Pony Express, but that's what we had to do. Some papers that we did during a death warrant were stuck at, never arrived on time. And we said, we sent them. And I went to the Greyhound bus station in West Palm Beach, and there they were on the shelf still. So it was a little like the Wild West as far as that went. But we had to figure out how to do it better. So I moved to Gainesville. I refused to move to Stark. I was willing to, Stark is too much. So I would move to Gainesville, okay. And that's when Charlotte Holdman, who was then the head of the ACLU in Florida, based in Miami, she moved to Tallahassee to take over the clearinghouse. And the one and only job of the person at the clearinghouse was finding counsel for people. She had a Rolodex. People wouldn't take her calls. I mean, it became the first, some of those names I read, Bill Shepard, Roy Black, Bob Harper, those people all took the first clients. They were big enough lawyers that they could afford to absorb the costs. One of the guys on death row said, "Look, you're asking somebody to come help you paint your house and bring the paint and pay for it. That is, please take this case and spend all your money doing it." There was no reimbursement for anybody, and that had to stop. And so there came a time, I think it was James Agan, do you remember, Mike, or Rollerson? One of those had a hearing before the Florida Supreme Court, and we all decided we were not going to pretend that it was okay, and there was no one at counsel table for that person during that appeal. And the court realized and said, we will not allow executions to happen if people do not have lawyers. And so the Attorney General, was Shevin at the time, as I recall, went to the legislature to get a system of post-conviction. That means for the non-lawyers, all the proceedings that are part of, especially a criminal case, that get you one more review in state court and then get you into federal court. So they would make an agency, it still exists now, Capital Collateral Representation. They had one agency in Tallahassee. They thought, wrongly, that if they made an agency, that there would be lawyers there, yes, but that they would be able to kill people faster. None of us who were going to do work, no. Our job was to put marbles on the floor and make it harder. But So they then thought they could cripple it a bit by splitting it up into 3 different agencies. And that's how it is today. There's the North, Middle, and South region. And they did that so that no one place would have the institutional memory of what had happened. There was no central place anymore. And that's the system that we have now. That's how that got started.
And I might add to that, post-Furman, the modern era of the death penalty after the Furman decision in 1972, there have been 367 commutations or clemencies granted by the executive branch, governors, sometimes a clemency board in the United States. And I can't remember, it's either 5 or 6 in Florida. That's it. And all were granted early in Bob Graham's first term as governor.
Since
So,
1983, there's been no clemency.
yeah. So I had a letter from James Hitchcock, who was executed, I don't know, a couple months ago. And he told me that he didn't even have a clemency hearing. Well, he did in 1982. And he said it was 83, something like that. Clemency was denied. So all of his years, 49 years on death row, perfect behavior, had nothing to do. They wouldn't even look at it. He still got killed. The uh, Anyhow, it's a travesty.
Yeah. Yeah, the clemency process in Florida, I think often in the public imagination, people think that there's this, 11th hour decision to grant clemency or not. And some states do function more like that. But here in Florida, once a death warrant has been signed, clemency has been denied, right? And the, expectation based on many years of history at this point is that clemency doesn't get granted. And it's I think it's just another way that the system fails. And speaking about the system failing and kind of the promise of Gregg and Proffitt and Jurek is that there were these safeguards around the death penalty and around how it was carried out. And Mr. Kendall, could you share a bit about what you and lawyers like you thought that the constitutional fight was going to look like after the Gregg decision? Like, did you have any, did you believe that the system would deliver on what Gregg promised?
Well, I can speak for myself. Before Gregg, there had been kind of a systematic constitutional attack on the death penalty. It started out by Tony Amsterdam bringing habeas cases on behalf of rape defendants who'd been sentenced to death because the overwhelming number of them were Black. So it fit in. He started doing this with the Legal Defense Fund. It fit into the Legal Defense Fund's civil rights focus. Then the Legal Defense Fund, long before I was there, began to represent all death row inmates because there was systematic racial discrimination in the way the death penalty was imposed, apart from the death penalty for rape. But in 1971, in 2 decisions, the Supreme Court had rejected due process attacks on the death penalty and held it was okay to have have one proceeding in which guilt and sentence were adjudicated, and also it was okay to do it without standards. That led to the final, I'm going to call it a Hail Mary set of decisions, which has been mentioned before. The Furman set of cases, there were 5 cases, and then the California case dropped out. And I was a law clerk at the Supreme Court with Justice White at the time. There, the court, by a 5-4 vote, held the death penalty unconstitutional because there was too much discretion, and it was like being struck by a bolt of lightning, that the state didn't really mean it. Now I'm summarizing the 2 swing decisions by White and Stewart. But the court wrote 10 decisions. There were 9, each justice wrote separately, and then there was one per curiam for the court of the 5 justices who would vacate the death penalty. That led, as Susan said, to the states rebounding. I felt that I wasn't sure that the death penalty, it seemed to me a barbaric atavism. I wasn't sure that the states were going to go back and reinstate it. Some did not. Most did. And I left the court and joined the Legal Defense Fund a year or so later. By then, the states were roaring back and passing death penalty decisions of two kinds: the mandatories, and then the bifurcated proceeding cases. That led to the decision which we talked about in July 2nd, 1976, holding that the bifurcated statutes were okay. Now, after that, the Legal Defense Fund tried to develop materials for lawyers to use on behalf of death sentenced inmates. We frankly look bleak in terms of any overall constitutional challenge. The Legal Defense Fund had a number of people that it represented, and once we represented somebody for cert, we represent them all the way, and I had a number of cases that came out from that. I don't think we had a feeling that there was any kind of constitutional theory at the time remaining. In every case, though, you look for not only the death penalty issue, but you look to all kinds of other challenges. And often the fact of the death penalty being involved put pressure on the state to justify procedural irregularities. So we were often able to win on those. We tried to get counsel for other people. We would go to public defenders, people we knew who had some of the death penalty cases we were representing, but try to get as many people represented as possible. What did we expect? Well, I thought there was still a chance for knocking out some kinds of death penalties. For example, on July 2nd, 1976, they held in abeyance the rape cases they had, in which the life of the victim was not taken. In October, they granted review in one of those cases. I can't remember if there were 5 or 6 people who were sentenced to death, but they're basically from Florida and Georgia, maybe one Texan. And they chose, I think everybody was black except the case they granted in, which was my case, Radelet Coker, who was white. And that case, I argued it in March of 77. It came down in June of that year. And they struck down the death penalty for rape where the victim's life was not taken. So what we expected was a series of cases where issues would be litigated. The country really, and Michael pointed out that the last execution was in 1967. So the country was not familiar. Judges weren't familiar, prosecutors weren't familiar. There were a number of stages that you had to go through. Susan referred to those. You had, first of all, you have a trial in which the death penalty is imposed. Then there's got to be an appeal. Maybe the state, there may be an intermediate court and then the state Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court of the state affirms the conviction and sentence, then you can go into state post-conviction proceedings, habeas corpus or something like that, and litigate in the trial on appeal if there's an appellate court and the state Supreme Court again. And then you still have a chance at federal habeas corpus. And you go from the district court to the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court. So there are a number, again, you've got to find, this is where legal skill comes in, you've got to find issues that will fit the case. But I think, to get back to your question, this is a wordy answer, I'm sorry. I think we were expecting just a lot of guerrilla battles, no one strategic campaign, but a lot of individual battles to try to keep people alive.
Let me add a couple
go ahead, Michael.
Okay. A couple little quirks. That is, in 1972, when the new death penalty statute was passed in Florida, they couldn't decide whether the judge or jurors should sentence the guy. A senator named Edgar Dunn was behind this, and he told me this story where the legislature met in special session in Tallahassee right after Thanksgiving in 1972. And the Senate passed a bill saying that it would be a three-judge panel making the life and death decision. The House passed a bill that it was going to be the jury. And they adjourned for the day, went over to somebody's room in some hotel, drinking a lot, and finally somebody blurts out and says, "Well, hell, why don't we make the jury vote recommendation and the judge can take it or leave it?" So Florida had this really weird thing where a judge could ignore basically a unanimous recommendation from a death qualified jury. You had to be pro-death penalty still to this day to sit on a death penalty jury. And even if they voted 12-0 for life, the judge could still override it. There's several people. Doug McCrae had a 12-0 life recommendation. That was one of the quirks. With this override, they finally got rid of the override, although in Florida now it's the most liberal. This is the only time you say Florida and liberal at the same time. But anyhow, the most liberal death penalty statute in the country, where it can be an 8-4 death wreck, and you still get 8-4, 8-4 wreck, and you still can get death. Most states are unanimous. But anyhow, there were 167 cases where the guy got a life wreck, that is, 6 or more people on the jury, death qualified, voted life, and the judge could and did still impose the death penalty. 4 of those guys were executed. So anyhow.
And 2 of them are still on Florida's death row. There's still 2 12-0 life recommendations to this day. And yeah, so looking at, thinking about the last 50 years, as Mr. Kendall and Miss Carey know. And
David, please, David.
Don't say ma'am either, please.
I can help that.
We already feel old enough.
When executions resumed in 79, I know both of you were represented John Spinklink in different capacities. And, that was kind of the start of, it was not the first execution in the country post Gregg. Utah holds that dubious distinction, but it was the first execution where it was the first contested execution where the defendant had filed appeals and argued against that. And just hoping you could share some about, what that case representing Mr. Spinklink might have foreshadowed about the next 50 years of death penalty litigation.
I for one, was not looking 50 years ahead, believe me. Kind of like one day at a time. But we knew Bob Graham had redone the clemency hearings that in between there, Askew was gone and we had the new governor, Bob Graham. And he redid, to his credit, he thought, I have to do clemency hearings on the people. Again, I need to hear them, not just take the word for whatever happened before. So he redid the clemency hearings. And the day after that is when John's warrant was signed. And I had just moved to Gainesville because we knew that this was, it sometime would come. But it was clear to us that this was very serious and that there wasn't a lot of place to go. So I went to the prison, and I went to talk to the warden. Nobody had told him that it was this serious. There had been other warrants signed between there, but the warrant was actually the way to say clemency's been denied. And so there were people in various stages, but this we knew was very serious and could happen. The warden did not know that, and closed the door, and we had a very frank discussion. I felt like it was better for John's situation, that he knew what was happening. This was really serious, and so every single day that week, myself and Tom Feemster, and I don't remember if there's anybody else. Tom Feemster was his spiritual advisor, an Episcopal priest. We went to battle with the warden and assistant warden about what would happen on that day, about his access to his family, about visits, about really everything. And they, for example, were not going to allow Tom Feemster to spend time with him right before the execution. The executions at that point were set at 7 o'clock in the morning. And we were willing to take that to the press, and they knew that. I mean, even on movies about people being killed, it's always the priest or the minister that can spend the time with them right up to that moment. And we said we would fight about that. And they finally stepped back and said he could spend that time. Then there was a question of, by this time, Florida usually, instead to this moment, has contact visits, family visits are contact visits. You sit in a room and talk. But during a death warrant, they're not. They're behind glass. And so there was a question of having a final contact visit. And John had this wonderful girlfriend who had kids, he considered her his wife, and the kids considered John their father. So there was a question of, okay, he can see his mother or his girlfriend, but not both. And we said, no, you cannot make him make that choice. That is cruel. And, because his mother was on the front page. Remember, this was news back then. Now it barely makes the paper at all. This was front page news every day, what was happening. And there were pictures of Lois Spinkelink trying to see her son. And she was I don't know how old she was. Probably I'm older than her now that she was then, but still, she was a very friendly, sympathetic picture of this woman who is trying to see her son. And they realized that they didn't want that either. So they finally reneged and let them visit. Every day was like that.
I think Lois Spinkelink ended up at the 1980 Democratic Convention.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter.
Bob Grand killed my son. She had a sign. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
So that's how it was here. And then David knows he and Deb Finns were in the courts trying to do stuff, and other lawyers too, but they were on the road. David, you should chime in if you want to.
Well, my recollection of the timing is a little bit different. We had a clemency hearing. Florida is a great sunshine state in terms of government. So there was a televised hearing. I later learned, and I thought it had gone reasonably well for us. We had a number of people who gave written testimony on John's behalf. We lobbied as I recall, all of the cabinet were there, including the Attorney General Bob Shevin, who was not on our side, of course. But a couple of the others were the Commissioner of Agriculture. We thought were favorable to us. And the hearing seemed to me to go reasonably well under the circumstances. But the state showed pictures of the deceased, and they were bloody pictures. And later we learned by a couple of press accounts in one book that the governor, Governor Graham, really had a weak stomach. And that's what turned in his mind the final punishment, because it was not an aggravated crime as such things go. John had killed another drifter. He was an escapee from prison. He'd walked away from a minimum security prison in California. He had a funny last name, Spinkelink, spelled differently in some of the different proceedings. The crime happened in a university town, and they offered. He had a good pair of defense lawyers. They were offered on the steps of the courthouse a plea to murder too, and John wouldn't take it. And so it was with a co-defendant. The co-defendant walked. John went to the second phase and they returned a death sentence. I doubt that anybody on the jury thought that death sentence would ever be imposed. So we had those things going for us in the clemency hearing, but didn't do any good. I remember maybe it was 6, 7 weeks later, getting a call from the warden's, the warden's office by the operator I knew. Her first name is Mary. I've forgotten her last name. Gravelly voice, good person, and said the warden wants to talk to you. And I knew immediately what had happened. He said, I want to let you know that we just had John in. The governor signed his warrant this morning. Execution will be in a week. So I went down to Florida. Debbie Finns joined me at some point. We did a lot of last minute filing of legal papers on his behalf, trying to get a rehearing in the Florida Supreme Court. I had promised John at some point early on, I think in preparation of his cert petition to the Supreme Court, 75, 76, somewhere back then, he asked me, well, if it goes down, will you be there? And I had said yes, without really thinking very much about it, I guess confident that we would prevail somehow. Well, and as it ticked on, and as his case became first, and I always believed that the Florida Attorney General's office chose him as first because of the things I mentioned: ex-con, white, university town, funny name. He said, I want you to be there. So I said, okay. And so we fought and fought all that week. And Susan's mentioned some of the things that were going on. They were very afraid of suicide. And in one of my first visits there, when I had come down from DC, I mentioned this to John, and he said he put his finger to his lips, and he turned. We were talking through a glass petition, which had a kind of microphone. He turned the microphone just a little bit, and there was a gap then between the microphone and the glass. And he looked at that, and he said, he made a gesture. I could have slipped him a razor blade or somebody. They were worried about contact visits, but he could have easily gotten a razor blade in that way.
I don't think anybody else knew that those things happened, but yeah, you could actually have passed stuff through if you wanted to.
Yeah.
We never announced that fact.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, it happened, and but both Reverend Feemster and I were there, and it was awful. So,
and I was thinking today, scribbling out some things that I wanted to mention. One of his advocates was the Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, for Speak. I'm thinking about it today because Todd Blanche, who will be affirmed tomorrow, I think, as Attorney General, I don't think he'll defend a death row inmate while he's in office. But you never know.
Might become a death row inmate, but we don't know.
Yeah, right.
That's
But it was also very horrible because there was a stay. Remember, David? There was a stay, and we thought, okay. And then the 11th Circuit, to this moment, has never been able to justify that stay.
The Fifth Circuit.
Yeah, the 11th Circuit didn't agree. Yeah.
For the 11th Circuit, and then it was dissolved by the Supreme Court.
Can I shift the tone here a little bit?
It pushed the execution off 3 days, I think.
Right, but then we'll just finish. Let me just finish this part. Yeah. We're done with this part. So in the middle of the night, we find out that the stay has been lifted. Literally the middle of the night, and they say, "Come for your visits." And I will never. That was non-contact visit. It was the middle of the night. Everybody is exhausted, thinking there would have to wake up, and the kids were there too. And it was there were 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The youngest one started really crying, and I was holding. We had to go. I knew that John would be very upset to see her crying, and so I took her, Vernalee, that was her name. this child, and took her to the other end of the room because it's non-contact visiting is on. It's a long, narrow room with booth things, so I could be on the other side, and I'm holding this sobbing child who is saying, "Please don't let them kill my daddy. Please don't let them kill my daddy." And I just wondered, if people in the world saw what happens to kids and families and all that, how in the world they could think that that was a good thing. How in the world could you think, even if you had been that wounded, that by doing that to this child, that would make you feel better? Because those kids believed they wanted to die too, because they knew that they would see their daddy in heaven. And it was very serious for the next few years with them, especially the boy, about whether to stay alive or not after that had happened. And that's not unusual for children. And so sometimes it just makes me like, how can you say, I deserve to have that person be killed, so I will feel better and know that ripple effect? Anyway, I'm done with that.
Yeah. I It's so powerful, and certainly something that still see so many families are impacted by an execution, and it I think those are often untold stories. And I've seen that over the last 18 months here in Florida, which I'll talk about in a bit. But Dr. Radelet, I wanted to kind of circle back to you that you've spent your career studying, many different aspects of the death penalty, public opinion and wrongful conviction and racial disparities in death sentences. And if someone were to ask you, actually, I am asking you, what have we learned in 50 years? What would your elevator pitch be on that?
Okay. The reality is, even though this is a depressing subject, the sky is falling, especially in Florida, we have made enormous progress towards worldwide abolition of the death penalty since 1976. In 1976, at the time of Gregg, there were 16 countries around the world that had abolished the death penalty. Today, there's 145. 16 versus 145. In 1976, there were very few religions that had any statements about the death penalty. Today, the majority of religions, at least their leaders, have statements opposing the death penalty. Most recently, Pope Leo in Chicago in May. The public support for the death penalty has dropped like a rock. In 1984, 80% of the American public in the Gallup polls was supporting the death penalty. The last Gallup poll that asked, given the alternative of life without parole, the figures were 36% of Americans supported the death penalty, 36%, and 60% supported life without parole. That's done by Gallup, very conservative public opinion pollster, but it's legit. The guy is good. The In 1976, some of the supporters of the death penalty supported it because they thought it was cheaper to kill the guy. Why should my tax money be used to support this guy for the rest of his life? Well, we know what happened to that argument. The number one reason for supporting the death penalty was deterrence. We need the death penalty to reduce the homicide rate. Bob Graham, I remember one time hearing him say, show me another way. He wanted to reduce the homicide rate, and he thought the only way to do that was killing people. And today, I don't know, I sat through all the arguments here in Colorado in the House and Senate when we abolished the death penalty in 2020. Not a single witness came forward to argue that the death penalty was a better deterrent than long imprisonment. No criminologist is arguing that anymore. It's just totally fallen off the plane. Nobody in 1976, nobody worried about innocence. That was not a major argument. In Florida, it appeared all of a sudden with the exoneration of two innocent guys in Miami, Pitts and Lee, famous case from the 1970s. But nationally, it never picked up until the 80s and late 80s. And now that's one of the chief things that foes of the death penalty talk about. There have been 202 people released from death rows since 1976 because of innocence. Another guy will be exonerated later this week with the next couple of guys. A guy from Delaware. Delaware has abolished the death penalty. This is a former death row inmate who the stuff is coming out in a couple of days about how he was innocent. Botched executions, nobody worried about that. Nobody cared. When Jesse Tefero in 1990 caught on fire in Florida's electric chair, May 3rd, 1990, and I was sitting with his mother in my living room. God, the Bob Butterworth, the Attorney General, said, "Well, that's okay. Uh, uh, I think more people are going to be thinking twice about coming to Florida because we can't guarantee our electric chair works all the time." This kind of stuff. It was good for Botch. It was good that he caught on fire. Pedro Medina in 1996, he also caught on fire in the electric chair. And the impact on his minister, a guy named Glenn Dixon from Gainesville, Glenn couldn't even do his funeral because he was so upset 2 or 3 days later. He asked me to do his funeral. God, talk about being desperate. But anyhow, the impact on the family, it's an ever widening circle of tragedy. Your family is affected by the homicide. We're going to get back on your, we're going to double the number of innocent families who are mourning the loss of a loved one. DeSantis said something just recently about we need this to help families of homicide victims. I think it was the last execution. He killed an 80-year-old man. This is going to help families of homicide victims. I've worked a lot in Colorado with families of homicide victims where the murder hasn't been solved by the police. Half the homicides in the United States aren't even solved. And if you ask families of homicide victims, what's the number one thing we could do to help them out? It's solve the murder. It's not take somebody who otherwise is going to die in prison. It's giving more resources and better resources to police officers who can work and solve some of these crimes. So the arguments against the death penalty has really changed precipitously since the time of Gregg, and it's all in the direction of abolition. So in the United States today, the states that are executing, it's led by Florida. It used to be Texas, but now it's Florida. Fewer and fewer states are having the death penalty. And, as I said, public support for the death penalty has really dropped like a rock. And I'm sure that's hard to remember when you're standing in a field across from Florida State Prison. The most miserable moments that I ever had in Florida were doing just that. But we got to step back, look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that is an optimistic picture with, the big executing countries these days are China, North Korea. We don't have any data on how many executions they do. It's a state secret. But the United States is in fourth place behind Iran. I think it's Yemen.
Saudi Arabia, I think, is in there.
Saudi Arabia is right up there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, not usually, these are not the countries we usually share our human rights agenda with.
Mike, we should talk a little bit about our work that we did here in Gainesville with the parents of murdered children.
Sure.
Okay.
How did
You
that
started
start?
it, and then
Yeah, I was at a debate in the law school in Gainesville, I don't know, years ago, and there's a person whose daughter was murdered. And in the debate, I, I didn't know what I was talking about. I said something really stupid. I said, well, just because you oppose the death penalty doesn't mean that you oppose families of homicide victims. After all, families of homicide victims get all this support from the churches, and the churches oppose the death penalty. And after the meeting, she and I became really close friends. She came up and she said, "Hey, you egghead, come to our meeting of parents of murdered children. We meet at the Burger King next month. And why don't you listen to the experiences of families of homicide victims with what they go through with religious leaders?" And I remember one person said, the minister said, "Well, thank God your kid is in a better place." Another one did the uh, British royalty line. Thank God you have another kid, an heir and a spare. All sorts of totally inappropriate things. And then they disappear. They never, it was Gainesville citizens against the death penalty who remember those families, also families of the executed, but send in a little card, we remember. So anyhow, in Colorado, it started out I wasn't really going to talk about this, but we formed, I did a death penalty debate one time, and there was a guy whose son was murdered, and he said the death penalty is irrelevant to me because they haven't found the killer. So I invited him to my class in Boulder, and he said, "We're trying to start a group of families of homicide victims where the murder hasn't been solved. And but I don't have any money. I don't know how to research these cases, blah blah blah." So I stood up and said, "Howard, this is the University of Colorado. We don't pay students to do research. They pay us. They sign up for independent studies." So Howard and I did a class, I don't know, 19 or 2002, I think, going out to document every unsolved homicide in the state of Colorado. They have there's no statute of limitations, so the cops are supposed to have the lists. So the students were going out and getting a list of homicides and putting a real spotlight on these cases. Some of the cops wouldn't help, but others were happy to have any support they could get for solving the cases. And we started having lunches for the families of the homicide victims. A couple hundred families would show up and tell their stories. But then in 19, uh, I don't know, we abolished the death penalty in 2000. So there was a previous thing, maybe 1998 or something. There was a death penalty abolition bill, and all these families of homicide victims showed up at the Capitol for the arguments and for the debates. There were so many people that had to move it from the state capitol to the old Supreme Court thing, a couple hundred families of homicide victims with a picture of their loved one saying, we don't want the death penalty. We want to find out who killed our kid. So that year was unsuccessful, but a couple years later, during COVID, Colorado abolished.
Yeah.
And there are now, I wrote it down here, 12 states, 12 states that have abolished the death penalty since 1976. Who would have thought? Uh, and one state abolished it and they brought it back, but it was Nebraska. Nebraska is like the football team wears red. It's the reddest state in the country. The although the N stands for knowledge on the football field. But anyhow, Nebraska abolished the death penalty. The governor vetoed it, and the legislature overrode the veto. But then he owned the Chicago Cubs and TD Ameritrade, rich guy, and donated a bunch of money. They put it on the ballot, and of course they brought back the death penalty. But that was pretty amazing. So states all over are abolishing the death penalty. I mean, um, 12 states abolished the death penalty. I think there's 29 states right now that still retain the death penalty. Most don't use it. But that's, a third of the death penalty states in the United States have abolished it. That's a great victory, and we need to remember that and celebrate it. Again, even though when you're dealing in Florida, DeSantis will someday be gone. And we've had great governors. Who was the governor? 1959, Leroy Collins, great liberal, and he also spoke out against the death penalty. I met him in Charlotte's office, so he lived a long life, uh, uh, really opposing the death penalty. So, Jesse Jackson used to say, "Keep hope alive," and I think there's plenty of reasons for death penalty abolitionists in Florida to remember this is the long game, but in the end, uh, we're going to win.
Yeah, it's and I am probably going to turn back towards a darker edge, but I have two questions left, but it's often easy to forget that, even here in Florida, where we have the lowest standard for imposing a death sentence in the country right now, you could have an 8-4 jury vote. Last year, there were only 5 new death sentences imposed in the state. And of those 5 in which a jury voted, one man waived his jury, only one of them was a unanimous vote. So far in 2026, we've had 4 new death sentences in the state, and none of them have had unanimous juries. And so, even here where the death penalty, our state's leaders have accelerated towards it, public opinion and juries are not in line with that. And so the death penalty eventually won't be able to sustain itself in Florida and really anywhere. But it's the long game, certainly. I wanted
And
to,
let me just say, in the 80s and 90s, there were 2 years where Florida imposed 39 new death sentences, not counting the resentences. So, man, what tremendous victory for people, you all down there in the trenches. Wow. Who would have thought?
yeah, and yeah, it is hard to remember that at times, but the state is still moving away from the death penalty. I did want to get everyone's reaction. Over the last 18 months, Florida has carried out executions at the fastest rate in state history. Texas certainly surpassed us at various points in the past, but last year, from the first execution in February to the last execution in December, we averaged an execution every 16 days. This year has been actually the pace has been a bit faster. Susan Carey has been next to me for many of them, and she's been in the trenches as well. And I just kind of want everyone's reaction to what you have thought and considered as you've seen this happening in Florida over the last 18 months.
Well, it's not
It's
only,
not good.
Not good.
yeah, it's not only the numbers. I mean,
No,
I was down in Everglades prison in Miami in January, visiting a former death row inmate who died 2 weeks after I visited him. But in any event, the thing is like a nursing home. People are walking around with, those poles on wheels, getting nutrition and stuff like that. It's just really something. Um,
I know that this sounds a little like, oh, if Millard Farmer used to say to us, well, with all this shit, there must be a pony here somewhere. And
yeah.
I don't think that is, y'all didn't, we should have had Millard Farmer on our list too. He was a
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
fantastic lawyer in Georgia. And I cannot begin to imitate his drawl, but that,
He
that
got
I
he
just
got the
said
te-
taking a whole minute.
he got the plea bargain offers for Ted Bundy. We think Ted Bundy is the worst guy that ever walked the streets of Florida, but in both his cases, Chi Omega and Kimberly Leach, he was offered life if he would have pled guilty, and that's a uh, Millard Farmer with the guy who ran CCR for a while. I forget his name.
Joe Nursey.
Yeah,
And yeah, was that they had team defense. That
right.
was the end. But I know I look at Facebook sometimes and there's this repeating thing about hope that I found again. It was something I wished I could remember, but I just found it right before I want to read this. People speak of hope as if it is this delicate, ephemeral thing made of whispers and spider webs. It's not. Hope has dirt on her face, blood on her knuckles, the grit of cobblestones in her hair, and just spat out a tooth as she rises for another go. So, to me, I mean, even though on Tuesday it was horrible, Tuesday last week, the people, in the name of the people of the state of Florida, on one of the hottest possible days of the year, there were 2 executions. There were new people that came. Nobody shied away. There were new people that we had never seen before.
A Catholic bishop came.
The bishop
Really?
came.
Mhm.
There was a church in McClenny that fed us like the fishes and loaves and took care of us. And then we went back for the next execution. It was still hot. People were there, and there were more new people that hadn't been able to come in the morning. So there's more new people, there's reinforcements. It wasn't just us, the same people who are out there every time. There was a new busload of people from Our Lady of Lourdes in Daytona Beach. And out of the nowhere, this angel starts singing Ave Maria in a way that still makes me chill just to think of it. Her voice carried over the entire group, including this god awful guy who stands over there playing Another One Bites the Dust at full volume every time. She sang like he didn't exist and singing Hail Mary, full of grace, be with me in the hour of my death out there in the wilderness was like biblical. You couldn't not think something more important and bigger than us is at work here. And then, as if that were not enough, there was this giant black cloud that suddenly appeared over the prison. And as we're leaving, it rains, but only over the prison area. Either way direction you went on Route 16, it was dry. I'm just saying.
This is my last question was really what gives you all hope, and Susan Carey just did. See, I'm calling you Susan Carey instead of Miss Carey. That's my compromise here. Susan Carey, that.
My most memorable time at the prison was, there's an execution. It's a losing event. We're all sitting around, somber, kneeling, doing whatever. And some reporter came up to a woman next to me, or I could hear what they were saying. And the reporter says, "Well, how come you come out here? Do you expect to change the opinions of Floridians?" And this woman, without thinking, I wish I remembered her name or knew her name. She said, "No, we're not here to change public opinion. We're here so that the public doesn't change us." Pretty good line.
Awesome. That's awesome.
But I think there's other things. I mean, I can't see any of the people that are on this call, but I see when I go to conferences, I used to know everybody there. I hardly know anybody there now. That's wonderful. It means that there's new people and they have all their hair and none of it's gray. None of us had gray hair when we started doing this. You would see pictures of us at the time and you wouldn't recognize us, right? And they're smart, good, savvy people that are doing it their own way. And we do know that we're so out of line with the entire world, except for China and Saudi Arabia and North Korea. Do we really want to be in that company? But I'm thinking if we get different decision makers, we may have a shot. So go vote, please. Don't sit home and say, "Oh, there's nothing I can do," and we're get the same people again. That's what's happening. So, dust yourself off. We still have work to do. There's still people on death row who need us to be out there. When we hit that gong, they hear us. They know that we are there. Can you imagine being a person on death row right now with a number of death warrants, wondering every time the door opens if you're next? I mean, the stress is incredibly horrible. And I think, honestly, for me personally, we have to show up when there's nothing we can do, especially if there's nothing we can do to be witness with those people that they know they're not by themselves with this, that we're there. We will walk with them as long as we can. Just some of the people on death row and everybody who's ever met people, and I'm not romanticizing, I'm not saying open all the doors, everything's wonderful, but I am saying that the people that we know there have been our amazing teachers about life and death and value and guilt and shame and atonement and redemption. And what does that mean? Then how do you have a life? And how do I make it okay? How can I, sitting on death row, some have become amazing artists, some have they were musicians on the outside. I'm thinking of Ed Kennedy, was a musician and turned to art so that he didn't lose his humanity, that make a conscious effort to keep healthy and make a life so that, some of us maybe aren't doing the legal work in the court, but people have a life while they're on death row. And people on the outside who were watching and listening can write to people and say, how can I help you get through this day? Send a postcard, do whatever you can do, because there is a community. They are our best teachers. I am not romanticizing. I am not saying that the things that have happened are not absolutely horrible, because they are. But for me personally, when I have to look at crime scene photos, I don't keep those pictures in my head. I have to go to Butterfly World when that's over. So we have to have our loyalty. There's this wonderful essay by Camus talking about beauty and the humiliated, that we have to be loyal to both. We can't stay on the mountaintop and just, drink tears of the Buddha and all that, because there's this other stuff to do. But if we stay in the gutters all the time, our cauldron has to be big enough to hold all of that we are true to the beauty and the humiliated, and I remember Ed Kennedy, the other guy I was mentioning before, the one who said shouldn't have worry that we have casualties, also said to me, don't get too sad about this. The love is always greater than the pain. And I thought, oh yeah, that's fine. You're going to be gone and we have to deal with this. That's great. I realized it was right, because what it was not that the awfulness isn't awful, is that this membrane of whatever is holding us together stretches, and it can hold it, and we can keep doing it until it's over. Then be quiet.
I'm glad you said there was a bishop there on that last execution. Back in the day, the bishop, was it Sullivan?
Snyder
Was very supportive when Bob Sullivan was executed in November of 1983. The bishop told the pastor of St. Edward's Church in Stark, "Get out! The death penalty abolitionists are taking over your rectory." So we all stayed in the rectory. And Father Bob Baker, later Bishop Bob Baker, very, very active in anti-death penalty stuff. I was thinking, DeSantis says he's Catholic. We can debate that, but if so, maybe those bishops could excommunicate him.
Take him to the woodshed.
Really.
Snapping on their wrists. The nuns. Yeah. That was our habeas popus, remember? The Pope, the habeas popus. The Pope said, we kept Bob Sullivan, not we were at the prison with Bob Sullivan, but it was last visits, and all of a sudden they came in and said, you have to go home. There's been a stay. He got a 24-hour stay. During that time, he got to know that the Pope had made a plea for his life. He was killed the next day, but he stayed alive. The bigger team, but had gotten the Pope to intercede on his behalf. It meant the world to him. Yeah. So his focus doesn't work sometimes, but
I think, when you have real humans in front of you, the legal doctrine kind of slips away. And at the end of the day, these are real people who have lives and people who care about them. And, just to wrap us up, Mr. Kendall, could you just say what gives you hope about I'm not going to call you David, I'm sorry. What gives you hope about the next 50 years of the death penalty in Florida and nationally?
Well, I can speak better nationally, I think, and I building on what Michael said about the evolution of things are in the right direction. the legal doctrine here, which is most applicable, I think, to the death penalty as a general punishment, is the Eighth Amendment in the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, protecting citizens against cruel and unusual punishments. Now, that unusual phrase is the way ultimately the death penalty is going to be declared unconstitutional. It will, I think, take a number of years, different Supreme Court justices, and the nonsense about originalism and everything. I mean, if there was an original justice who really believed it, that justice would look to see what is unusual today, would be the death penalty. But so that gives me hope, but it's in the long term. And I think what's really going to take are some drastic executions of innocent people. That's what's turned the tide in many countries and in many states. And unfortunately, I think with our greater medical technology, I think we can, hope that at least that those devices and technologies will help to persuade others that look, the death penalty is wrong. We're not engaged in a dispute about whether to punish somebody. We're just engaged in a dispute about how to punish them. And anybody who knows anything about life in a maximum security prison who thinks that is a bed of roses is really woefully mistaken. So in the long run, that gives me hope, but that is the long run.
Sure. This is we're all looking at the long run here. Thank you all so much for joining tonight and for sharing your experience with all of us. And thank you to all of the attendees. We will certainly post the recording of this on our YouTube channel and share links, but just really wanting to express my gratitude. And for those of you who are not familiar with Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, please visit us at FADP.org for more information about our work, as well as information about all of our wonderful panelists tonight. And with that, I will say goodnight to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Good to see you, David, Susan.
Bye,
Yes.
David. Bye, Michael.
Cheers.
Bye, Grace.
Bye,
Y'all
guys.
give us hope.